We are looking at Youngstown, Pennsylvania for the second time. We're looking at the corner where we left off. On the first view, we have the Tin Lizzie over here. Over in this corner, this is a parking lot now, but there's something that's not there anymore. That was the Red Lion Hotel. It was an inn. It was an old inn that dated from early days. An interesting character, Mr. West, ran the place. He and his Indian wife. He died in 1912. He had been a Civil War veteran, also a county commissioner. This is the best I can do for a picture of the place. But it was a place that had been there for a long time. That's Joseph C. West, who ran the place. He was known to be a great woodsman, a hunter, and those abilities served him well in the Civil War. And when he came home, he ran a tavern in Youngstown, he and his wife. Served the county as a commissioner at one point. Passed away in 1912, leaving a lot of interesting stories about him. Now we're looking at the center of Youngstown, the intersection of Latrobe Street and Main Street. Over here was where the Tin Lizzie would be built. This was J.C. West's hotel, a place called the Red Lion. Now, this is a view from the air. Youngstown is over here. What we see over here is Kingston. And the distance between Youngstown and Kingston is only it's less than 2 miles. I point this out because I want to talk a little bit about Alexander Johnston. Alexander Johnston was a very important local person. He was somebody that George Dallas Albert, the local historian who grew up in Youngstown, actually knew. And he recalled talking to him. He has some of the stories from him in the book that he wrote. Alexander Johnston was probably an old man when this was done. And I suspect that he had been ravaged by a stroke. The shape of his mouth at this point shows that he had a rather unnatural configuration. But when you read Albert's comments on the man, you hear him talk about a wonderful person, a person who would have respect for every human being, it would seem. He was also a politician. He ran a tavern out there at Kingston where he lived. And also he was an iron maker. He was involved in making iron out there. This is the house that he had built out there in around 1813, excuse me. He had this place built, and during that time when it was building, he is listed as one of the first postmasters at Youngstown. I put this in here to show that before Alexander Johnston got out to Youngstown and Kingston, shortly after he arrived in this country from Ireland, he was in Greensburg, and he had a job there as a tavern keeper at a place that stood pretty much where the Rialto now stands in Greensburg. And he had very good ability to get along with people, very great political instincts. He was, by turns, county sheriff. He was recorder of deeds, register of wills. He had a number of county positions. He also worked as when the Greensburg and Stoystown turnpike was being built past his house in Kingston, he took on the job as contractor, and he did contracting for that section. His house out there at Kingston is now on the National Register of Historic Sites. And speaking of post offices, this was one of the earlier post offices in Youngstown. I don't think Alexander Johnston worked at this one. I think he worked at an earlier one, but I put this in because I wanted to show you the character or quality of some of the abilities, some of the buildings in Youngstown. When this place was torn down, the second floor had been torn off, the siding had been torn off, and you can see what this thing was made of. This and a number of other good old houses in Youngstown were log houses, and some still are. And I suspect that before it was a post office, it might have been a tavern. Now we go into this corner right here. It has the Reverend B. Wimmer as owner there. And what that means was that St. Vincent owned the place. That was the Catholic Church. Boniface Wimmer never really actually was the pastor there. Only in name. He would have sent one of the monks from St. Vincent out to be the pastor. This was the older Catholic church that stood in Youngstown. That's the church there now. Up on the far eastern end of town where the road splits goes up to Chestnut Ridge, and in the very distance you can see Chestnut Ridge up there. Now this is what we were looking at, this place right up here. Next we look at a few things down this way. We'll see the Lutheran church and the schoolhouse, the town schoolhouse. That was the Lutheran church. That was the actually the oldest congregation in town were Lutherans. They formed probably as early as 1800, before there might have even been a church there. And this was one of their churches along the way. Also, in that toward that southern section of town was the old town schoolhouse. This is a two-room schoolhouse. I remember one time interviewing a lady who was close to 100 years old then. She had taught in a school smaller than this. It had been a one-room country school, Mrs. Sowers, down in Washington County. And it was interesting to hear her talk about the school day, how the kids coming in, mostly from farms around there, were not just noisy problems to deal with, but they were like part of the help. The older boys showed up and got the old potbelly stove going before the rest of the students got there. They warmed the place up. During the course of the day, the teacher had help with the older girls and boys. They'd help with the younger kids. It was an interesting thing that the kids were not just being taught the 3 R's, they were being taught the rudiments of being useful people and getting along in society. Good lessons, useful things. Youngstown again, there was a schoolhouse out here on this side. This was actually in the township. That was, I believe, the school named after the guy who filed the first patent for the place, Baldridge. Over on this side you can see a brickyard. And I think that might be enough. I think we're going to cut this one short right now, and maybe we'll have one more. We'll finish on Youngwood. Extremely, I'm sorry, Youngstown, not Youngwood.